The pot bubbled on top of the clay stove, steam rising into the frozen air of the cabin. Outside, wind screamed through the Montana darkness, driving snow sideways in sheets that buried everything under drifts taller than a man. Elias Kern placed another small log into the fire chamber, knowing the stove would hold heat for 6 hours on that single piece of wood. Across the valley, Nathan Wardell's iron stove had gone cold 2 days ago, his family huddled under blankets burning furniture to stay alive. Before we begin, let us know in the comments where you're watching from, and if you've ever experienced a winter that tested everything you thought you knew about survival. If stories like this one move you, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's tale of frontier ingenuity will leave you speechless. Elias Kern fed another split log into the clay stove and watched the flames catch along the dry wood grain. The fire was small, barely more than a campfire, but the heat radiating from the brick walls filled his cabin with warmth that seemed impossible given the fury of the blizzard outside. Snow had been falling for 3 days without pause. The wind had reached speeds that tore shingles from roofs and toppled trees across trails. The temperature had dropped so far below zero that spit froze before it hit the ground. This was the 5th day of what people would later call the Great Blizzard of 1847, and Elias was cooking stew. The pot on top of his stove simmered with venison, wild onions, and dried beans. He had added snow to the pot that morning, and the residual heat from the previous night's fire had melted it without him needing to build up the flames. The clay bricks surrounding the fire chamber absorbed heat slowly but held it for hours, releasing warmth long after the flames died down. It was a principle Elias had discovered through years of experimentation, trial, failure, and obsessive refinement. The stove looked primitive compared to the cast-iron models his neighbors had purchased from the trading post. The bricks were irregular, handmade, fired in a pit rather than a proper kiln. The mortar between them was creek clay mixed with sand and ash. There were no fancy dampers or chrome fixtures, but it worked better than any iron stove ever built, especially in conditions like these. Elias knew that Nathan Wardell's family was in trouble. He had seen the smoke from Nathan's chimney grow thin 2 days ago, then stop completely yesterday morning. An iron stove was an efficient heater when you had unlimited fuel, but iron conducted cold as efficiently as it conducted heat. When the temperature outside dropped to 30 or 40 degrees below zero, the metal walls of an iron stove became ice to the touch. They pulled heat from the fire and radiated cold into the room. You had to keep the firebox packed with wood continuously just to maintain minimal warmth, and in a blizzard like this, leaving the cabin to gather more wood from your stockpile meant risking your life in whiteout conditions where you could lose your way between the cabin and the woodshed 20 feet away. Elias's clay stove required a fraction of the fuel. The thick brick walls insulated the fire, preventing heat loss to the exterior cold. A single armload of wood kept the cabin warm for an entire day. He had enough fuel stacked inside to last 2 more weeks if necessary. His neighbors, who had laughed at his mud stove and bragged about their modern iron equipment, were learning a hard lesson about the difference between what looked advanced and what actually worked. But this moment, this blizzard, this validation of everything Elias had built, had roots that went back 4 years to a different winter and a tragedy that had changed everything he thought he understood about survival in the mountains. The winter of 1843 had been cold, but not catastrophic. Elias remembered it as the winter of small failures that accumulated into disaster. He and Catherine had been living in their Montana cabin for 2 years, trapping and trading furs, building a life that felt solid despite its isolation. They had purchased a cast-iron box stove from Henry Cobb's trading post the previous autumn, spending nearly a full season's profit on what Cobb had promised was the finest heating equipment available west of the Mississippi. The stove was beautiful in its way, with ornate feet and a door that closed with a satisfying metallic click. It had seemed like a symbol of civilization brought into the wilderness. Catherine had been pregnant that winter. The baby was due in late February, and they had prepared as well as they knew how. The cabin was chink tight against drafts. They had stockpiled firewood, salted meat, dried vegetables, and flour. Elias had even traded for a bottle of whiskey to use as antiseptic when the time came. Everything seemed ready. But on January 15th, a cold snap descended that was unlike anything Elias had experienced. The temperature dropped and kept dropping. The iron stove, which had seemed so efficient in moderate cold, became inadequate. Elias fed it constantly, keeping the firebox packed with wood, but the cabin never got truly warm. Catherine developed a cough on the 3rd day of the cold snap. By the 5th day, it had settled into her chest. By the 7th day, she was feverish and struggling to breathe. Elias kept the stove burning hot, going through their wood supply at an alarming rate, but the iron walls of the stove seemed to radiate cold as much as heat. He would press his hand against the exterior of the stove and feel warmth, but the metal sides facing away from the fire were cold to the touch. The stove was losing heat through its thin walls faster than the fire could generate it. Catherine needed sustained warmth to fight the pneumonia that was killing her, and the iron stove couldn't provide it. Elias had tried everything. He hung blankets around her sleeping area to trap heat. He heated stones in the fire and wrapped them in cloth to place around her body. He kept the fire roaring day and night, leaving the cabin only to bring in more wood from the depleting stockpile outside. But it wasn't enough. The cold was relentless, and the iron stove was simply inadequate to the task of heating a frontier cabin in truly extreme conditions. Catherine died on January 22nd, holding Elias's hand, her breath coming in shallow gasps that finally stopped. The baby died with her. Elias buried them when the ground thawed in April. He marked the graves with stones from the creek and stood there for a long time, trying to understand what had happened. The rational part of his mind knew that pneumonia killed people on the frontier regularly. Medical care was non-existent. Winters were harsh. Death was common. But another part of his mind, the part that would drive everything he did for the next 4 years, kept returning to a single observation: the stove had failed. Not because it was poorly made or improperly used, but because iron, for all its apparent superiority, was fundamentally wrong for this environment. Iron conducted heat away from where you needed it. Iron required constant fuel. Iron couldn't hold warmth through the long, cold nights when fuel ran low and survival depended on residual heat. Elias didn't make a conscious decision to invent something better. The obsession grew slowly, like ice forming on a pond, until it covered everything. Elias spent the spring and summer of 1843 trapping alone, working his lines with mechanical efficiency while his mind turned over the problem of heat retention. He sold his furs in late June and returned to his cabin with supplies, but no plan, only a growing conviction that iron was the wrong material for survival heating. He needed something that held heat the way stone held the warmth of summer sun long after darkness fell. He needed thermal mass, though he didn't know that term. He only knew that some materials absorbed heat and released it slowly, while others, like iron, gained and lost heat rapidly. The answer came from an unexpected observation in August. Elias was checking his beaver traps along the creek when he noticed the clay bank where spring floods had carved away the topsoil. The exposed clay face was warm to the touch despite being in shade. The sun had been heating it all day, and the clay was radiating that warmth hours after the direct light had moved on. He pressed his palm against it and felt heat soaking into his skin. The clay was holding energy in a way that wood or stone didn't. He dug out a chunk and carried it back to his cabin. The first experiments were crude. Elias built a small clay structure in his fire pit, forming walls around the fire to see if they would retain heat. The wet clay cracked as it dried. He tried mixing it with sand to reduce cracking. That helped but created a brittle result that shattered when heated. He added grass to the mixture. Better, but still not strong enough. He tried animal hair from hide scraps. The clay held together but smoked terribly when heated. Each failure taught him something, but progress was agonizingly slow. Nathan Wardell visited in September and found Elias surrounded by broken clay experiments. Nathan was a practical man who had settled in the valley 2 years earlier with his wife Margaret. He looked at the cracked clay pieces scattered around Elias's cabin and shook his head. "You planning to cook on mud, Elias?" Nathan's tone was friendly but dismissive. Elias explained about heat retention and thermal mass. Nathan listened politely, then suggested Elias was overthinking the problem. Iron stoves worked fine if you kept them fed, just needed more firewood was all. Maybe if Elias spent less time playing with creek mud and more time cutting wood, he'd stay warmer come winter. The comment stung because Nathan wasn't wrong. By conventional wisdom, every trapper and settler Elias knew relied on iron stoves or fireplaces. They were proven technology. They worked adequately most of the time. Elias's obsession with finding an alternative seemed eccentric at best, dangerously misguided at worst. But Elias couldn't forget Catherine dying while an iron stove burned uselessly nearby. He couldn't forget the feeling of that cold metal radiating chill into the room despite the fire inside. So he kept experimenting with clay while his neighbors shook their heads and wondered when Elias Kern would accept reality and move on with his life. Jakob Reinhardt arrived in the valley in October of 1843, a German immigrant with metalworking skills and dreams of establishing a blacksmith shop to serve the scattered frontier community. He was a compact man in his 40s, with calloused hands and a methodical way of examining everything he encountered. Elias met him at Henry Cobb's trading post when Jakob was purchasing basic smithing supplies. They shared a meal, and Elias mentioned his experiments with clay heat retention. Jakob's response changed everything. In the old country, Jakob explained, his uncle had been a brickmaker, not just any bricks, but specialized fire bricks used in industrial furnaces and bread ovens. The secret wasn't just in the clay itself, but in how you prepared it and what you added to make it withstand extreme heat without cracking. Jakob had learned the basics as a boy, watching his uncle work. The key was finding clay with the right mineral content, mixing it with sand in precise ratios, and adding organic material that would burn out during firing, leaving tiny air pockets that allowed the brick to expand and contract without shattering. Elias took Jakob to the creek bed and showed him the clay deposit. Jakob dug samples from different depths, squeezed them between his fingers, even tasted them. This lower layer, he said, pointing to clay 2 feet below the surface, had the right texture. It was dense but not too heavy, plastic enough to shape but not so sticky that it would shrink excessively when drying. They spent a week testing mixtures. Jakob taught Elias to wedge the clay, folding and pressing it repeatedly to remove air bubbles and create uniform consistency. They mixed it with sand at a 3-to-1 ratio. They added finely chopped straw that would burn away during firing. The real education came when Jakob showed Elias how to fire the bricks. They couldn't build a proper kiln, so Jakob improvised a pit firing method. They dug a trench, lined it with stones, and stacked the formed bricks inside with channels for airflow. They covered the pile with more clay and built a fire that they maintained for 3 days, feeding it constantly to keep temperatures high enough to vitrify the clay without melting it. The process was labor-intensive and required constant attention. When they finally opened the pit and pulled out the fired bricks, Elias held pieces that rang like pottery when tapped and showed no cracks. Jakob also taught him about mortar. The mixture had to bind the bricks without cracking from thermal expansion. They tested combinations of clay, sand, and wood ash until they found a ratio that dried hard but retained slight flexibility. Jakob explained thermal shock, the phenomenon where rapid temperature changes shattered rigid materials. Everything Elias built would need to accommodate expansion and contraction. By November, Elias understood the principles. He had materials that could withstand sustained high heat. Now he needed to figure out how to build a stove that would prove everyone wrong. Elias began construction in late November of 1843, working inside his cabin as the first snows fell. He had spent weeks sketching designs on birch bark with charcoal, trying to visualize how heat would move through a clay structure. The principle seemed simple. Fire generates heat. Thick walls absorb that heat. The absorbed heat radiates inward for hours after the fire dies. But translating that principle into a functional stove required solving problems he encountered only through building. He started with a base layer of flat stones to protect his wooden floor and provide a stable foundation. On top of this, he laid his first course of bricks, forming a rectangle roughly 2 feet wide and 3 feet long. The fire chamber needed to be large enough to accept standard firewood pieces, but small enough that the brick walls stayed close to the heat source. He used Jakob's mortar between each brick, working carefully to keep the courses level. The walls rose slowly, 1 layer each day, to allow the mortar to cure properly. The design evolved as he built. Initially, he planned a simple box with an opening for fuel, but he quickly realized that draft mattered. Fire needed air to burn efficiently. He left a narrow gap at the base of the front opening, creating an air intake below the fuel bed. Hot air would rise, drawing fresh air in from below, creating circulation that would burn wood more completely and generate more heat from less fuel. He built the walls 3 bricks thick, creating substantial thermal mass. Each brick was roughly 3 inches wide, meaning his walls were 9 inches thick overall. At 12 inches of height, Elias faced his biggest challenge, creating the cooking surface. He needed a flat top that could support the weight of a cast iron pot filled with stew, but he also needed to maintain the fire chamber below. He solved this by placing iron bars he had purchased from Jakob across the top of the walls, then laying bricks across these bars to form a solid cooking platform. The bars would conduct some heat upward, and the bricks would radiate heat they absorbed from below. The result was a flat surface that would stay hot for hours. He built a crude chimney from stacked bricks rising 2 feet above the cooking surface, creating draw for smoke. The opening was intentionally small to retain heat while still venting enough to prevent the cabin from filling with smoke. The entire structure, when finished, stood roughly 3 feet tall and weighed several hundred pounds. It looked primitive compared to the ornate iron stove that had failed Catherine, but Elias wasn't building for appearance. The first test came on December 8th. Elias loaded the fire chamber with kindling and small logs, then lit it. Smoke poured into the cabin initially, but as the chimney warmed and draft established, the smoke rose and vented properly. Within an hour, the brick walls were warm to the touch. Within 3 hours, they were almost too hot to hold your hand against. The heat radiating into the cabin was substantial and even, nothing like the concentrated blast from an iron stove. Henry Cobb visited Elias's cabin in January of 1844 to collect payment on a trade debt and found Elias tending his clay stove. The fire inside was small, barely more than coals, but the cabin was warm enough that Elias wore only a wool shirt despite the freezing temperatures outside. Henry stared at the brick structure occupying one corner of the cabin and asked what in God's name Elias had built. When Elias explained, Henry's expression shifted from curiosity to concern that bordered on pity. Henry ran the only trading post within 50 miles. He made his living selling goods freighted in from St. Louis at considerable expense and risk. Iron stoves were among his most profitable items, marked up significantly to cover transport costs. Each stove he sold represented substantial profit. Henry had sold Elias the iron stove that had failed to save Catherine. Now Elias was claiming that creek clay and handmade bricks worked better than manufactured iron equipment that represented the peak of industrial civilization. Henry's arguments were reasonable and persuasive. Iron stoves were proven technology used throughout America and Europe. They were designed by engineers who understood thermodynamics. They were manufactured in foundries with quality control. They came with warranties and replacement parts. What Elias had built was a primitive pile of mud that might work temporarily, but would crack, crumble, and fail when subjected to sustained use. More importantly, Henry suggested gently, Elias was making decisions based on grief rather than logic. Catherine's death was tragic, but blaming the stove was a way of avoiding the harder truth that sometimes people died on the frontier regardless of preparation or equipment. Elias didn't argue. He simply showed Henry the numbers. He had been tracking fuel consumption carefully. His clay stove heated the cabin for 24 hours on 1/3 the wood his iron stove had required for the same temperature. The clay walls stayed warm for 6 to 8 hours after the fire died completely, radiating stored heat. His iron stove had gone cold within an hour of the fire, burning out. The difference wasn't marginal, it was substantial and measurable. Henry examined the stove more carefully, touching the warm bricks, looking at the construction. He acknowledged the heat retention seemed impressive, but maintained that iron stoves had advantages Elias was ignoring. They heated up faster when you needed quick warmth. They were portable if you moved locations. They had adjustable dampers for temperature control. They looked civilized rather than primitive. Henry left unconvinced, and within a week, Nathan Wardell visited with similar concerns. Nathan had heard from Henry about Elias's clay stove and wanted to see it himself. He brought Margaret, who was pregnant with their first child. They examined the structure while Elias explained the principles. Nathan's reaction was more direct than Henry's careful diplomacy. "It's mud, Elias. You built a fancy mud pile. When it cracks apart next winter, don't come asking to borrow my iron stove." Margaret said nothing, but her hand rested on her swollen belly, and her eyes met Elias's with something that might have been understanding. The clay stove worked flawlessly through 3 winters. Elias added refinements each year, improving the mortar mixture and adjusting the chimney height for better draft, but the basic design remained unchanged. By the autumn of 1846, his stove had proven itself reliable beyond doubt. He used a fraction of the firewood his neighbors burned. His cabin stayed warmer with less effort. The bricks showed no signs of cracking or deterioration, but convincing others remained difficult because iron stoves worked adequately most of the time, and people trusted manufactured goods over handmade alternatives. November brought early cold and unusually heavy snow. Elias watched the weather patterns with the attention of someone who had survived multiple mountain winters. The wind came from the northwest, steady and bitter. The sky had a peculiar gray quality that suggested more than typical winter storms. Animals behaved strangely. Deer moved to lower elevations weeks earlier than normal. Squirrels had stripped pine cones frantically through October, hoarding food with unusual intensity. The signs suggested a severe winter approaching, possibly the worst in years. Elias prepared methodically. He cut and split firewood until he had enough stacked inside his cabin to last a month without leaving the structure. He checked his food supplies, smoked additional meat, and organized everything within easy reach. He reinforced his cabin's chinking and made sure his windows were sealed tight. Most importantly, he verified his clay stove was in perfect condition, cleaning out accumulated ash and checking every brick for signs of stress. The stove had become more than a tool. It was his lifeline, and he treated it accordingly. Nathan Wardell took a different approach. He had purchased a new iron stove from Henry Cobb that autumn, a larger model that Henry promised would heat more efficiently than older designs. Nathan was proud of the purchase and confident in his preparation. He had cut firewood through the summer and had a substantial pile stacked outside near his cabin. When Elias mentioned his concerns about the coming winter, Nathan dismissed them as excessive caution. Every trapper claimed to read weather signs. Most were wrong, more often than right. By late November, the temperature had dropped steadily. Snow fell almost daily, accumulating faster than it melted. The wind increased, blowing from the north with a persistence that suggested sustained cold ahead. Elias visited Nathan's cabin on November 26th and found the family comfortable, their iron stove radiating heat while Nathan fed it logs. Margaret offered coffee, and their 2 children played near the stove's warmth. Everything seemed fine, and Elias felt foolish for his concerns. He left as light snow began falling again. The wind had a different quality now, harder and more sustained. Elias returned to his own cabin and added extra wood to his interior stockpile, making one final trip to his woodshed before dark. The temperature was dropping rapidly. By midnight, the wind was howling, and snow was falling so heavily that Elias couldn't see his woodshed 20 feet from his door. The Great Blizzard of 1847 had begun. The blizzard struck with a ferocity that exceeded even Elias's pessimistic expectations. Wind speeds increased throughout the first night until the cabin walls shook with each gust. Snow fell so heavily that visibility dropped to 0. The sound was constant and overwhelming, a roar that made thinking difficult and sleep nearly impossible. Elias fed his clay stove a small fire and felt the walls warm gradually, radiating heat that filled the cabin despite the fury outside. He settled in to wait, knowing this storm would test everything. By the morning of the second day, the temperature had dropped to levels Elias had rarely experienced. When he cracked his door to check conditions, the cold hit like a physical blow. Snow had drifted against his cabin wall to a depth of 4 feet. The wind drove ice crystals horizontally with enough force to sting exposed skin. He closed the door quickly and added another log to his stove. The fire was small, but the brick walls glowed with stored heat. His cabin remained warm while using minimal fuel. Elias thought about Nathan's family. Their iron stove would be burning through fuel rapidly in these conditions. Metal conducted cold inward as efficiently as it radiated heat. In extreme temperatures, iron stoves became thermal liabilities, pulling warmth from rooms faster than fires could generate it. Nathan would be feeding his stove constantly, burning through his firewood stockpile at an unsustainable rate. And eventually, he would face an impossible choice: brave the blizzard to reach his outdoor woodpile or let his family freeze. The third day brought no improvement. If anything, the storm intensified. Elias maintained his routine, adding small amounts of wood to his stove every 6 hours. The clay bricks absorbed heat during burning and released it slowly between fires. His cabin temperature remained stable. He cooked simple meals on the stove's flat-top surface, melted snow for water, and stayed comfortable while the blizzard raged. His indoor firewood supply was barely touched. At this rate, he had fuel for weeks. On the fourth day, Elias began to seriously worry about his neighbors. He had seen no smoke from Nathan's chimney since the second day. That could mean several things, none of them good. Either Nathan had run out of fuel, his chimney had become blocked with snow, or the family had abandoned their cabin to seek help elsewhere. The last option was suicidal in these conditions. A man could lose his way between cabin and woodshed. Attempting to travel any distance in whiteout conditions meant certain death. The fifth day was colder still. Elias's thermometer, hanging inside near the door, read 10 degrees above zero inside his cabin. Outside, he estimated temperatures had dropped to 30 or 40 degrees below zero, with wind chill making it far worse. No human could survive extended exposure to such cold. The blizzard showed no signs of weakening. Snow continued falling. Wind continued howling. And somewhere across the valley, Nathan Wardell's iron stove sat cold and useless while his family fought for survival. The knocking on Elias's door came near dawn on the 6th day. At first, he thought it was wind-driven debris hitting the cabin wall, but the rhythm was too deliberate. He opened the door and found Margaret Wardell collapsed in the snow, her children clutched against her body, all 3 of them covered in ice and barely conscious. Elias pulled them inside and shut the door against the screaming wind. Margaret's lips were blue, her hands frozen claws that wouldn't release her. Children. The 2 kids, a boy of 5 and a girl of 3, were frighteningly still. Elias moved them near the clay stove and began the careful process of warming frozen flesh. Too much heat too quickly could cause as much damage as the cold itself. He wrapped them in blankets and let the stove's radiant warmth work gradually. Margaret's eyes opened after several minutes. "Nathan," she whispered through chattering teeth. The stove went cold, ran out of wood. He went outside to get more. 3 days ago, never came back. She had waited as long as she could, keeping the children wrapped in every blanket they owned, burning furniture for brief warmth, but eventually the cold had become unbearable. She had made the decision to walk to Elias's cabin or die trying. The distance between their cabins was less than half a mile, but in blizzard conditions with 2 small children, it had nearly killed them. Margaret had wrapped the children in layers of clothing and carried them both, fighting, through drifts that reached her waist, unable to see more than a few feet ahead. She had found Elias's cabin only because she knew the valley's terrain and had aimed for the slight rise where he had built. 100 yards in any other direction, and they would have died in the snow. As warmth returned to their bodies, the children began crying, a good sign that meant circulation was returning. Elias prepared warm broth from dried meat and melted snow, feeding it to them slowly. Margaret told him what had happened. Their iron stove had burned through fuel faster than Nathan had anticipated. By the 3rd day, they were running low. Nathan had made the decision to brave the storm and reach their outdoor woodpile. He had tied a rope around his waist, anchoring it to the door, planning to follow it back. Margaret had watched him disappear into the white. The rope had gone slack after 10 minutes. She had pulled it in and found the end frayed, broken against something sharp in the darkness. Over the next 2 hours, Margaret and her children recovered enough to sit up and take more substantial food. Elias fed his clay stove another small log and watched the brick walls absorb the heat. His cabin remained warm. His fuel supply was adequate. He had space and resources to shelter 3 additional people. Outside, the blizzard continued its assault, but inside, the clay stove that everyone had mocked kept 5 people alive with a fire barely larger than a candle's flame. The blizzard broke on the 7th day. Elias opened his door to a world transformed by snow and silence. Drifts reached the cabin's roofline in places. Trees were buried to their lowest branches. The landscape was unrecognizable, sculpted into alien shapes by wind that had finally died. The temperature had risen slightly, enough that breathing no longer hurt. Elias left Margaret and the children inside and went to search for Nathan. He found him 30 feet from his own cabin, frozen solid, half buried in snow. Nathan had made it to the woodpile but had become disoriented on the return journey. Without the rope to guide him, he had walked in the wrong direction and died within shouting distance of his home. They buried Nathan when the ground thawed in April. By then, 4 other families in the surrounding valleys had lost members to the blizzard. 2 trappers had frozen in their cabins when their heating failed. An elderly settler had died of exposure, trying to reach neighbors. A child had succumbed to cold in a cabin where the iron stove couldn't maintain adequate warmth. The Great Blizzard of 1847 became the benchmark against which all future winters were measured. People spoke of it with the reverence reserved for disasters that reshape understanding. In the months following, 7 families asked Elias to teach them how to build clay stoves. He spent the summer helping construct replicas of his design. Jakob Reinhardt provided technical guidance on brickmaking and mortar mixing. By autumn of 1847, clay stoves were heating cabins throughout the northern Montana valleys. The technique spread as people shared knowledge with relatives and neighbors moving west. For 2 decades, clay stoves were standard equipment in remote regions where fuel efficiency and heat retention meant survival. But the innovation didn't last. By the 1860s, railroads reached Montana territory. Manufactured iron stoves became cheaper and more available. New settlers arrived with no memory of the 1847 blizzard and no understanding of why anyone would build heating equipment from creek mud. Commercial stoves came with printed instructions and replacement parts. They represented progress and civilization. Clay stoves represented primitive frontier conditions people wanted to escape. Within 20 years, most clay stoves were abandoned or torn down, replaced by modern iron equipment that looked proper in respectable homes. Elias never built another clay stove after his original. He lived in his cabin until 1868, trapping less each year, eventually supporting himself through small-scale farming and occasional work as a guide. He died quietly in his sleep in December of 1871, 24 years after the blizzard that had validated everything he built. His clay stove was still functioning, still heating his cabin on minimal fuel, still proving every winter that sometimes the simplest solutions were the best ones. Margaret Wardell kept hers until she died in 1883. By then, she was one of the last people alive who remembered why clay mattered and what it meant to survive when iron failed, and only retained heat could keep you breathing through the darkness.